The talk show studio buzzed with anticipation as J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated vice president, stepped onto the set. He had just taken his oath of office, and the weight of his new role was evident. Yet, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to prove. Marcus Bennett, the show's host, had been preparing for this moment for weeks. Known for his sharp tongue and strong political opinions, he had promised his producer that this would be a respectful discussion about the new administration. But the look in his eyes told a different story. As Vance took his seat, the usual small talk before the interview felt rushed and robotic. Bennett's smile was polite, but didn't reach his eyes. The production team also seemed unusually tense. Vance, with his Marine Corps background, could sense that something was off. His years of military service had trained him to read a room, and right now, his instincts told him he was walking into an ambush. He knew Bennett's questions would be carefully designed traps. The first question came with a friendly smile, but Vance noticed Bennett's tight grip on his interview cards. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett began, his voice dripping with artificial politeness, "let's talk about your incredible journey from being a Trump critic to becoming his second-in-command." Vance smiled, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had learned from life's challenges. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a great place to start," he said, his voice calm and composed. "Because this is about more than just politics, it's about growth and understanding." The audience leaned in slightly. This wasn't the defensive response Bennett had expected. Bennett shifted in his chair, realizing his prepared follow-up might not be as effective as he had hoped. "Growth and understanding?" he repeated with a slight smirk. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "Some might say it's more about political convenience." Vance didn't flinch. "You see, Marcus, in America, we have a long tradition of being able to change our minds when we're presented with new facts. When I criticized President Trump years ago, I was looking at things from a narrow perspective. But then I saw something remarkable. His policies were actually helping the very people I wrote about in my book." Bennett's expression tightened ever so slightly. Vance leaned in just a little. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the facts and realized that your initial judgment might have been wrong?" There was the briefest hesitation before Bennett responded. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine." He shuffled his cards, clearly eager to move on. "Speaking of changes, let's talk about your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The atmosphere in the room shifted. The audience tensed. This was sensitive ground, and Bennett had just stepped onto it. But Vance's expression remained steady. "What I actually said," Vance replied, his voice full of conviction, "was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." A few quiet amens echoed from the audience. Bennett clenched his jaw. "Surely, in our modern, diverse society—" "Let me finish this thought," Vance interrupted, his tone firm but respectful. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, just like countless leaders before me. Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not from the government." Bennett glanced at his producer, who was watching closely from the sidelines. "You know what's interesting, Marcus?" Vance continued, a hint of personal reflection in his voice. "When I was a Marine, no one questioned the presence of chaplains. No one complained when we prayed before missions, because in those moments, even the skeptics understood there's something deeper than politics." Bennett's face reddened slightly. "Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump," he said, pressing forward. "You recently said he was God's instrument for America's renewal. Don't you think that's a bit extreme?" Vance's demeanor didn't change. "What I think is extreme," he replied calmly, "is how some in the media are more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that actually help American families. Bennett tried to jump in, but Vance wasn't finished. Since you brought up President Trump, let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's talk about what's actually happening in our communities. The studio grew unusually quiet. Even Bennett's usual fast-talking style seemed momentarily subdued by Vance's steady presence. Bennett shifted in his chair. Let's talk about your background, Mr. Vice President. You've written about your humble beginnings, yet now you sit in the halls of power. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from. Vance smiled slightly. That's interesting, Marcus, because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by whether they fit into Washington's expectations. Bennett scoffed. Character is my zip code or my job title. Bennett narrowed his eyes. So, you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition? I'm saying, Vance responded, that unlike some in the media, I don't measure success by how many people I can please. I measure it by whether I stay true to the principles I was raised with. Bennett leaned forward, his voice sharp. So, should we just ignore your past criticisms of Trump? Are we supposed to accept that you're now his, he paused for effect, puppet? Gasps filled the room. The word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Vance didn't react emotionally. Instead, he spoke with a quiet strength. You know, Marcus, that word, it reveals more about you than it does about me. His voice carried an undercurrent of steel. In your world, loyalty is something to mock. But in mine, loyalty is earned through actions, not media narratives. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues have created. The audience erupted in applause. Bennett tried to interrupt, but Vance wasn't finished. You call it being a puppet. I call it recognizing true leadership. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump. Bennett smirked. A man of your intellect must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once criticized. Vance chuckled. There you go again, Marcus, so focused on finding contradictions that you're missing the bigger picture. The audience roared in approval as Bennett's producer frantically signaled from the sidelines. But Vance had the last word. And since you brought up my background, he added with a knowing smile, why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty I've been seeing in your coverage? The room fell silent as the discussion took an unexpected turn. The interviewer, Bennett, had started with an air of confidence, ready to challenge Vice President Marcus Vance. But the conversation quickly shifted in a direction he hadn't anticipated. We're not here to discuss, Bennett began, his voice firm. Oh, but we are, Vance interrupted smoothly. He leaned forward slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. Because just last week you spent an entire segment questioning my faith. You suggested it was nothing. More than, what was the phrase you used? Yes. Convenient election season Christianity. Bennett's face turned red. I was merely pointing out the timing, he replied, struggling to maintain control. The timing of what, exactly? Vance pressed. That I've been attending the same church long before I entered politics? Or are you suggesting my grandmother's faith was just as convenient as the woman who taught me to pray before every meal, even? When we barely had food on the table, a woman in the front row nodded vigorously, showing her agreement. That's not what Bennett started, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Let me be clear, Vance continued, his voice steady and authoritative. You can question my politics. You can disagree with my decisions. But when you start implying that my faith is some kind of political prop, you're not just attacking me. You're attacking every American who holds their faith close to their heart. Bennett glanced at his notes, clearly searching for a way out. Let's talk about your recent statements, he suggested, hoping to shift the focus. Yes, let's, Vance agreed. Like your statement last month, where you said that anyone who supports traditional values is, and I quote, living in the past. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Tell me, Marcus, do you really believe that? Do you think the millions of Americans who go to church every Sunday, who cherish family values, who love their country, do you think they're all just stuck in the past? The studio fell into a tense silence. The audience, the producers, even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. Bennett fumbled with his papers, his polished persona beginning to crack. "Mr. Vice President, you're trying to turn this interview around." "No, Marcus," Vance said, his tone even. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the contempt you and your colleagues seem to have for everyday Americans. You invited me here thinking you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, my support for the president. But let's talk about what really bothers you." The studio was so quiet that even the sound of someone shifting in their seat seemed loud. "It bothers you that someone, like me, someone who comes from where I come from, doesn't subscribe to your worldview," Vance continued. "It bothers you that I went to Yale Law School and still believe in traditional values. But most of all, it bothers you that I can see right through the game you're playing." Bennett tried to regain control. "Your accusations they're not accusations," Vance said, his voice firmer now. "They're observations. Like how you rolled your eyes earlier when I mentioned prayer, or how you referred to my hometown as Trump country in a mocking tone on your show last week." The words landed like a thunderclap. The audience sat motionless, processing what had just been said. "This isn't about politics," Vance went on. "This is about respect. Respect for faith. Respect for traditional values. Respect for the millions of Americans who don't need your approval to love their country or support their president." Bennett's face paled. He glanced toward his producer, who was watching with a mix of concern and fascination. The interview had clearly strayed far from their planned ambush. "Perhaps we should move on," Bennett started, checking his watch. "Checking the time already?" Vance noted with a small smile. "I've noticed you doing that ever since we started talking about faith and values. Uncomfortable territory for you, Marcus." Chuckle rippled through the audience. Bennett's discomfort was now obvious. "For someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism," Vance continued, "you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way." Bennett made one last attempt. "Is this the same kind of deflection you used when you went from criticizing Trump to supporting him?" "There you go again," Vance replied calmly. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after getting to know them? After seeing their true character instead of relying on media narratives?" An elderly woman in the audience called out, "Tell him, Mr. Vice President." "You know what the real issue here is?" Vance asked, his voice filled with conviction. "It's not about my past criticisms or my current support. It's about something that terrifies you and your colleagues, the idea that someone can think for themselves, that someone can change their mind based on personal experience, and that someone can stand firm in their beliefs despite relentless media attacks." Bennett was visibly sweating now. "Mr. Vice President, you're twisting my words." "No, Marcus," Vance said, his voice level. "I'm just holding up a mirror. And I don't think you like what you see a journalist who came here hoping to embarrass me, but instead exposed his own biases." He turned slightly to address the audience. "You see, real integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you were wrong, even when people like him are waiting to pounce on you for it." The audience erupted into applause, the loudest yet. Even some members of the production crew nodded in agreement. "When I first met President Trump," Vance continued, "I had a choice. I could stick to my preconceptions, or I could judge him by his actions and his love for this country. I chose truth over pride, and that's something your network might want to try sometime." Bennett shot another desperate glance at his producer, who was now making a slashing motion across his throat, the universal signal to wrap it up. "And you know what else, Marcus?" Vance added. "The American people are tired. They're tired of being looked down on for their faith, tired of being mocked for their values. Most of all, they're tired of journalists who think their job is to tell people what to think instead of reporting the truth. The studio audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Bennett's attempts to speak were drowned out by thunderous applause. His carefully planned ambush had backfired spectacularly. "Well," Bennett said, clearing his throat, his confidence shattered, I think, "we're about out of time." "Yes, I believe we are," Vance agreed, rising from his chair. "But before I go, I have one last message for the American people." He turned to face the camera directly, his expression sincere and resolute. "What you witnessed today wasn't just an interview. It was about something much bigger, standing firm in your convictions. They thought they could shame me for my faith, mock me for my values, make me apologize for believing in tradition. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't just political stances. They're the principles that built this country." With that, he straightened his tie and walked off set. The audience's applause followed him, shaking the studio walls. Bennett sat in stunned silence, his planned attack completely dismantled. And in that moment, one thing was clear sometimes. The best response to arrogance is dignity. And the strongest answer to bias is the truth.